Good evening, everyone, and we'll call the meeting to order. First of all, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're in the Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Okay, first of all, we have the Ian. We're welcoming you here tonight, and we'll get with you in a second there. So the approval of the agenda, do we have a mover and a seconder, please? Moved by Peter, second by Don. Everyone in favor say aye. Aye. Contraminded, motion carried. Errors or omissions or correction of the minutes of November the 27th, 23. Any corrections or errors?
Oh, no, I don't have.
No corrections or errors. The minutes stand as approved. Okay, Upland Policy Direction Workshop. Ian, yep, sorry. No, that was on there by mistake. Yeah, just on cancel. Yeah, yeah. Okay, Ian, you're on the go. All right. Just as we walk through this, do you want questions or wait to the end or?
Yeah, no. So yeah, good to see you all. Happy holidays, all that. So the purpose of tonight, maybe what I'll. So as you'll recall, I guess in the fall we're doing engagement. Had the series of meetings, got a lot of good turnout and a lot of good feedback, and got some initial sense of where the community is at in terms of planning and key issues and all of that. And there's actually, I think just this week we released publicly the What We Heard report from that. So that's available on the project website now. So kind of where we are in the junction of the project right now is we're starting actually putting together draft municipal planning strategy, draft land use bylaw. And this will be an iterative process. We'll be coming back to you multiple times and to the public to refine those documents. But before we get too deep into the drafting process, we wanted to check in with you. There are some, kind of high-profile key topics where we could go multiple ways on how we address them. And it's really up to you as a council and as a PAC on how you want to address them. So the purpose of tonight really is, I guess next slide there. I don't know. Yeah. Is to get us, I think, some initial draft direction on these items. And I emphasize the draft there in the sense that we will be, as I say, having opportunities to refine it, but it gives us some comfort in putting the time and effort into coming up with initial drafts out of your direction. So we circulated a report. It was a lengthy report. You didn't have to read it all, but it did provide some context ahead of time. I've picked and chosen key topics out of that where I think it's really important to have some early direction from you as a committee. And so the intention for tonight is basically to go through those topics, highlight any obligations we have as a municipality as it relates to that topic. If we heard community feedback as part of the initial engagement, communicate that to you, what that feedback was generally, and then talk about some options for how you want to move forward on those particular topics. So, some of the things I expect to cover tonight are agriculture, coastal development, parkland dedication, rural commercial uses, accommodations. And so, yeah, I expect, this is a workshop. It'd be great if you can chime in with your thoughts because, like I say, this helps us in the drafting process to not put together a draft that's completely out to lunch with what you want. So, next slide there. Oh, there it is. Yeah. So, as a quick recap, I think we talked about this in one of the preliminary presentations, but it's worth highlighting again that here in Nova Scotia, in our planning framework, we kind of have three ways of approving things. There's as of right, site plan approval, and development agreements. And which ones we use for different things depend on how much time versus expense versus risk versus flexibility versus community involvement and management we want to have. And so you might hear me throw those terms around as we move through tonight. Making you jump back and forth. No? Yeah. So as of right, development would be the kind of bread and butter, most common process. That's where someone's proposal complies with the land use bylaw as it's written. You know, you meet the setbacks, you meet the permitted uses, you come into the development officer, they issue a permit. You know, it's an administrative matter, it's a staff matter, it's quick, generally, and straightforward, but it's not very flexible. A step up from that is site plan approval. In that case, we might have additional criteria in the land use bylaw. They're often design related, more qualitative, and there's some discretion in there, you know, for the development officer and the applicant to negotiate how the development meets that criteria. So that takes a little longer. You know, it's a little fuzzier, but it does offer more flexibility. But a little more risk as well. And then finally, we have development agreements and I guess also rezonings in that category. Those are what I call discretionary approvals. They come to council for approval. And this is where a proposal is evaluated against policies in the municipal planning strategy by council with staff support. And you draw up a contract that gets attached to the land that outlines the specifics of the development. And typically with a development agreement, you'd use it for complex projects where there's a lot of different issues to work out, or projects that have a strong public interest, where you would want to have a public hearing, because since it's a council process, there's a public hearing, and it's appealable to the utility and review board. So development agreements generally, we'd save them for the kind of big fish. And they also take longer, and there's some risks. So I just wanted to give that overview. There may be some, you know, those terms might come up tonight. Next slide there. So as we get into our drafting, and I think one of the key messages we heard in the public meetings in particular were, you know, a thread that's been in this project all along is a light touch in how we introduce planning into the municipality and how we regulate things. So we have that in the back of our mind, but we also do have obligations that we need to meet as a municipality. So there's 5 statements of provincial interest: housing, infrastructure, agriculture, drinking water, and flood risk areas. And agriculture is a big one that I want to talk to you about how you want to meet that. And then there's also in Nova Scotia now the minimum planning requirements regulations. And they are actually fairly light in terms of tonight's discussion. Basically, those requirements are what's driving this project, in the sense that you have to have planning, and it has to be comprehensive, but those regulations are pretty non-specific about how you plan. And then there's also engagement programs, contents regulations that come into one of the topics tonight. Next slide. So the first one, and I think this is one of the biggest ones in terms of how we draft the documents, is agriculture. So there is a standalone, there's a whole statement of provincial interest in the Municipal Government Act on agriculture. And it says that planning documents must identify agricultural lands, and it defines those based on soil classification. There was a mapping project done across Canada starting in the 60s into the 80s, where they mapped mapped the land based on soil capability. And classified them class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and unclassified, with 1, 2, 3, 4 being good soils. We don't have any class 1 in Nova Scotia, so we have to identify class 2, 3, 4 soils, as well as active agricultural land and specialty crops. So things like blueberries actually grow on really poor soils, but we need to identify them. So that's a baseline requirement. We have to identify them. We also must address the protection of agricultural land, and that's a little more fuzzy. There are some suggestions in the Statement of Provincial Interest for how you might do that, like giving priority to agricultural uses in those areas, limiting subdivision in those areas, like the number of lots that can be created, having separation distances between agricultural and non-agricultural development, and having limitations on the topsoil removal. But those are suggestions, and that idea of protecting agricultural land is context specific. The Statement of Provincial Interest recognizes that not all agricultural lands can be protected if there's, other goals that need to be met, especially when it comes to the other statements of interest. So, for example, if we have a serviced community, and one of the statements of provincial interest is to use our services efficiently, if we have a serviced community, we might prioritize development in those areas, even if they are good agricultural lands, because we're using those services that we have. I think there's a recognition at the provincial level of agricultural, this is from a province perspective, province-wide perspective, the scrutiny on protecting agricultural land is a lot higher somewhere like Kings County, where, it's kind of the breadbasket, or Colchester County, where it's crucial. Pictou, I would suggest, Pictou County falls somewhere in the middle of that, on a provincial scale importance, and therefore the expectation of how strict or not strict we will be. Next slide. So there's a map that Pictou County has a surprising amount of agricultural land, actually. The darker is class 2, middle green is class 3, the light green is class 4, and then the orange is active agricultural land. So it does illustrate, not all good soils are farmed and not all farms are on good soils. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, and it's one of the challenges in the provincial approach to protecting agriculture, is that there is a bit of a disconnect, though the idea is also that we may want those agricultural lands in the future. Next slide. So we did hear a fair bit on agriculture in our engagements, both through the public meetings, in the survey, and also we had a focus group with members of the agricultural community. Some of the key things we heard is that agriculture is vitally important to Pictou County. A number of concerns from members of the agricultural community about development encroaching on agricultural lands, losing those lands for all times, basically, and also the potential for land use conflicts. Even if a house isn't built right on your farm, if it's next door, there's a risk of, you're spreading your manure and now the new neighbor's complaining, or about the traffic, the tractor traffic on the road, for example. There's also concern from young farmers. We heard about agricultural land costs, it being hard to get into the industry as agricultural land gets rarer and more valuable. We did hear a clear message not to regulate the agricultural operations themselves. Like, farmers were very clear that they deal with a lot of regulation from the Department of Agriculture, Department of Environment, that the municipality doesn't need to be telling them exactly where a barn can be, or, that kind of thing. We also heard a request from the agricultural community to make sure we're accommodating agritourism, whether that's on-farm accommodations, restaurants, wineries, tours, whatever it is that provides that extra income that helps support the farm. And then kind of that other thread that always that's kind of in contrast to this is agriculture land is often your biggest asset as a farmer, and many farmers, it's their retirement. So there's a conflict there between the desire to protect agricultural land, but also have an asset at the end of your career to make sure that you're taken care of for all the hard work you put in. So that's something that needs to be balanced. Next slide there. So broad strokes when it comes to agricultural land, we kind of, in that framework of our obligation, as a municipality and what we've been hearing from the community, there's kind of three routes you can go. One is to and then there's kind of finer details within all of this that we'll hash out as we work on the drafts, specifics about lot sizes and all that kind of stuff. But, from a broad stroke point of view, there's three kind of main approaches. One is to meet the letter of the law and identify agricultural soils in the plan, speak to the importance of agriculture, but otherwise do very little to, regulate anything regulate agricultural lands any differently than any other rural area. And that's a valid approach. There is some risk on the provincial side of it that our current minister of municipal affairs is a former farmer or is a farmer, and certainly municipalities who are also going through this process have been under the microscope in terms of, are we adequately protecting agricultural land? So there is some risk there to approach number one on the provincial side of things. Option number two is to create some equivalent of, we've been doing this in a few municipalities where, agriculture wasn't a top priority on a provincial scale or for the municipality, where we create an agricultural potential zone or something similar to that identifies those good soils, communicates to people who might be moving there that, well, you're in the agricultural potential zone, maybe you should expect smells, tractors, all those things. There might be some minor differences in that zone between that and other rural areas in terms of, like, maybe we don't allow gas stations or something like that, like limited things that might be really high risk to agricultural soils. But otherwise, it's a fairly standard rural zone. And then the third approach would be to have a full-on agriculture zone that has significant restrictions on development that's not agriculture, and doesn't have to be a full-out prohibition. In Kings County, for example, you can only build a dwelling on the agricultural zone if you're a farmer, or a limited number of other exceptions. But it doesn't have to go that far, but it could be a zone that'd be significantly more restrictive than other rural zoning. So, and recognizing that today, this isn't, we're not setting these directions in stone. This is to give us guidance for the draft, and they can be tweaked both in the overall direction, but also in the details as we go through the process of reviewing these drafts and going out to the community. I would be interested in your thoughts tonight on where we should be putting our efforts in terms of those kind of three options.
So we'll stop there, Ian, and take some questions.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to pause there and.
Okay, Gordon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ian. This is probably, in this county, one of the touchiest areas you're going to hit. Coastal erosion might come in second. But farmers are a fairly small number compared to what they used to be. I think it said 201 farms in Pictou County. Some of those are very small, of course, and we have a few large farms, but they're still very vocal. And part of that is because you're not only dealing with the farmers, you're dealing with the farmers' families that are spread out in the communities and even in the towns. So there's a lot magnified voice when it comes to agriculture because many of those people who are working at other jobs right now came from the farm. And therefore they amplify the voice of agriculture. And so when you strike the wrong chord with agriculture, you hear it in a hurry from a lot of people. And that is what happened before, and that was the problem. I brought that up many times and was told not to be too negative. But anyway, I think the last one you had on a list there is one of the key ones, that this in many cases is the farmer's retirement package. He's put everything in, or she has everything into their farms over the years, knowing that when they're 65 or 70 or whatever, that's their retirement package. If they're not going to hand it on to a son or daughter, which doesn't happen as much now as it used to, it was be automatic for years, but that's a key one, and we can't solve that as a county alone. That is a provincial, they're gonna have to solve that if it ever does get solved. So I think it'd be really dangerous for us to try and solve it on our own. Somehow that agricultural land needs to be purchased, and that farmer gets paid what it would be worth if he sold it for housing or anything else. And then from then on, it's agricultural land. Whoever bought it at that price can't ever sell it for anything other than agricultural land. That's the only way it's ever going to be cured. So I think our safest way right now is to do very little. I do agree totally with protecting agricultural land. If we can find a way to do it that doesn't prevent that farmer from getting that retirement package to live on the rest of his life, then that would be good. But I don't think we can do that without provincial involvement. So that would be my sort of hesitation on moving. The one thing in there that I think we can move on and should move on is taking agricultural soil away as topsoil off of our interval fields or off of any good agricultural land. I've always felt that was wrong. I've seen them do it many times in our area because that's some of the best soil they want for lawns somewhere. But once you ruin that and you take the topsoil, that land's gone forever. It's not ever going to recreate some more good topsoil. That one I don't think would upset a whole lot of farmers. Upset a few industrial people maybe, but not farmers. So I think that's one that we can move on, my opinion, without upsetting too many people. Did I go over the clock, or are we keeping the clock tonight? Oh, good.
You're exempt. Anyone else have a comment? Go ahead, Don.
Yes, Mr. Chair, in considering the three options, I agree with the warden in that the third would be the most difficult to sell. Number two, it sounds like in the middle of the road. However, it could create problems in that you have restrictions in certain areas and you don't have them in other areas. And you hear people talking today about unemployment insurance. And, you know, for example, in Pictou County, you need 700 hours. And if you're across the line in Antigonish County, you need 500. At any rate, I think by creating certain rules for certain areas over others, that's going to create problems. Where agricultural seems to be agreed upon here that this is probably the most contentious issue that we're going to deal with, I think I would favor option number one, which has the least rules, but does provide some guidelines. So I would favor towards option number one.
Thanks, Don. Any further? No further?
Can we go back a slide?
Any further comments on that?
If not, I've got one more.
Yeah, don't see anybody's hand. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It involves the complaints that you get from people who move into an area adjacent to farms. And it doesn't matter if it's a big farm or a little farm, if the rooster crows first thing in the morning at 5 o'clock, I don't like that because, you know, it's waking me up too early. The rooster's got a job to do, he's got to get up early. But I dealt with one this past summer, and I'm still dealing with it. I dealt with it today. It's not going to go away. So the farmer is trying to protect his crop, decides to purchase one of these propane guns that go off every 5 minutes, originally all night long. So you can picture not just the new neighbors, but the old neighbors, because this had never happened before, not getting their sleep and being irritated and pretty near had a war in downtown Durham. Anyway, that just shows you how new problems can come out of the blue. We always hear of the hog farm, you know, and the smell and everything, but there's all kinds of new farming and new ways of doing things. And, you know, if you've got to accept the fact that if you're in an agricultural area, there's going to be some problems. But on the other hand, there's a certain onus on the farmer to communicate with his neighbors and try and come up with a solution, I think. And that's not easy to find right now on this one, I know. And there's other ones very similar to that. The farmer's up all night with the lights on trying to get a crop in or something, and somebody else gets irritated because these lights are shining in their window. There's a ton of things, so I think we have to think of that anyway when we're thinking of what comes, not just trying to save the land for future use, but how do we live together, I guess, and nobody wants a sawmill setting up next to them and running 24 hours a day. Well, to some people, that farm's the same way, but the old saying was always, if you moved in, you knew the hog farm was there, too bad. But if the hog farm moved in next to you, then it's a different story,
Yeah, we certainly heard that most at the Marigamish meeting. There was a fair bit of concern from farmers in the area who were dealing with people moving in and even though they knew, and then having those concerns. Yeah.
Any other comments?
Okay.
I guess you're good there, Ian, if you can take that information for that part.
All right, next slide there. So, I kind of combined two here because they're sort of related, and one's more just for an information piece here, is coastal and floodplain development. So we do have a statement of provincial interest on floodplains, and that statement says that planning documents must identify flood risk areas consistent with the Canada-Nova Scotia Flood Damage Reduction Program mapping and any locally known floodplain. So that flood damage reduction program, I think maybe from the 70s again, they mapped like high-risk floodplains across the province. I think there's 7 of them. There is one in Pictou County, and that is East River. So this is kind of more of an information piece here, is that to meet this statement of provincial interest, we will, through these documents, have to establish flood mitigation regulations around East River based on that floodplain mapping. Within the 1 in 20-year flood area, we basically have to prohibit development for the most part, by and large. And then in the 1 in 100 flood area, it's more generous. You got to have like flood proofing. There's different things you can do, but there's the ability to enable development.
Go ahead, Logan.
Yeah.
There's we're part of a Northumberland Strait working group, coastal, floodplain sort of study right now. Is that going to be integrated into this?
Yeah, so that is the big question mark on the inland flooding piece, is that there's that other second part of there's the 7 listed floodplains in the province that are part of that program. The other thing that's wording that they're picking up these days on the provincial level is the any locally known floodplain. And the way they're interpreting that is if you've done a flood study on any river that is now locally known, and you need to have regulations that reflect that flood study that you've done.
Would that be reflected in, would we have to revise our mapping and therefore amend our bylaw through that mapping, or can that be more general statements?
So yeah, from what I've been talking to Dan Bryce at the province about, so they're doing all of this work with the LiDAR mapping and then doing the studies, and the idea is to kind of do most major rivers, I think, in the province eventually. Is that the timeline for it is probably longer than all the municipalities doing their plans to meet the 2024 deadline. So it would be more of a thing where municipalities maybe put supporting policy in the plan, recognizing that this work is being done, and that when it's done, you'd come back and revisit those areas specifically. So, yeah, that's probably my expectation of where that's going for our purposes today.
Yeah, go ahead, Larry.
In terms of the East River is quite a long river, and it starts up in Sunny Brae and comes down into Pictou Harbor. So there's just not one. When you determine a floodplain, there's specific parts of the river that are going to be floodplain. It's not painted with a single brush stroke, right? Because it's considerably different in Sunny Brae than it is when it comes into the harbor. So
Yeah, so it would be based on the flood mapping that was done in the 70s or what?
And the other thing is that 1 in 100
Has changed.
flood events are changing considerably.
Yeah.
Same as hurricanes or winds, right, because of climate change. So that definition has to be looked at very carefully as well.
Yeah, so I suspect as part of this study that Logan's talking about, there may be a revisiting of these 7 floodplains, that were delineated in the 70s, and probably updating the boundaries of them, I suspect. And again, that's where you would come back when that work is done and possibly amend the boundaries around the East River. Yeah.
Go ahead, Robert.
So I live on the West River, and the West River floods at least 4 times every year. And all the way from our place right down to Pictou Harbor. You can drive down and look at all the fields full of water. And upriver from us some as well. So anybody that would build a house on that would be nuts, to put it mildly. But, but we don't have anything, I don't think it says you can't, because in fact, upriver ways, one fellow did. He just pushed the soil all up in one corner and got himself about 4 feet higher than the rest of the interval field and built the house on there. Now, maybe that wasn't a good move, but he thought it was. He's way down the hole. He must have a hard job getting out of there in the wintertime. But, it shows that people will build. Over in Truro for years, they built on that piece that floods all the time right in the middle of the town. They just took the soil and raised it up high enough so they could build there. Only made it worse for everybody else. But, in the case of the interval field where that fellow built, it's not a big problem. But should we have something in our plan, or maybe we already have something but that fellow built there, he must have got a permit to build, but that says you can't build on interval land that floods every year?
So that is kind of the idea behind the statement of provincial interest, is that on those areas where we know we have floodplains, that we would have some sort of restriction that either prohibits development or requires flood proofing or whatever it may be. The challenge in some areas is that as much as we know there's a floodplain there, we don't from a from a scientific point of view know exactly where the floodplain is without having done the study. So I think that's the kind of thing where when this work that Logan's talking about comes back where that study's been done, I presume, most likely, that West River will show up on that. Yeah.
Every river that's not already been mapped and updated, River John was updated, so they're not included in the study.
Yeah.
But all the other ones on the Northumberland Strait are 7 or 8 rivers, something like river systems. To your point, Warden, the only current rules that we have around development within a floodplain we don't actually control at all. It's provincially controlled with regards to septic systems. And that's really about groundwater levels versus, or the river high water marks and stuff like that themselves. So there are watercourse setbacks, but those are provincially regulated. And the only thing that we have under our building services building bylaw is that somebody has to have a septic approval. So you first focus with the province and get that, then you're allowed to get a building. But we don't review that at all further than that.
No, it seems like common sense should rule it, but sometimes it doesn't.
No further comments, questions?
So,
Go ahead.
all right. So, kind of related to this, or tangentially related, and then why I grouped them together is the issue of coastal flooding. So, as you likely know, in Nova Scotia, we have a Coastal Protection Act, but we do not yet have Coastal Protection Act regulations that put the act into force. And I think we're in round 3 of public consultation or something like that at this point. So we currently have no mandated obligation in terms of regulating coastal development in any way, but we do have the power to through the Municipal Government Act. You know, the next slide there. So in the initial engagement, coastal issues came up fairly frequently, and we did hear a fair bit of desire from the community for a proactive approach along the coast. And, that's not unanimous, but certainly I would say that was the louder voice whenever discussion of coastal issues came up. And kind of related to that is, you know, an understanding of the need to prepare and plan for climate change. And I think what we heard broadly too is, you know, balance in all of that, that we want to address environmental issues and safeguarding people, but also the, you know, the threat of individual responsibility and you know, not treading on people too much. So, next slide there. We did, so the areas in blue, that teal color, and this is a broad map. The intention is not to look at all the details tonight of this is in the background report actually, which we should talk about, Logan. So we did do some mapping of if you take current sea level rises or current sea levels and you add expected sea level rise by the year 2100, combined with the fact that Nova Scotia is sinking, and you put storm surge of a major storm, you know, what areas get flooded. And that's the areas in the, you know, it's kind of a worst case, but what are those elevations that would get flooded? And yeah, yeah, yeah. So, you know, those are kind of the highest risk areas in the teal, and if there were to be any regulations, would probably be the focus of those regulations. Next slide there. So the way, for the past couple of years in the planning work we've been doing with municipalities, ever since the Coastal Protection Act has come out, is our message has been, you know, I've been doing this for 10 years now, and in some of the municipalities I worked with prior to the Coastal Protection Act, there was a keen desire to, let's be proactive, let's put some vertical setbacks in, or horizontal setbacks, or both, along the coast to deal with erosion and sea level rise, and make sure we're being proactive in protecting people from those risks. When the Coastal Protection Act came out, our message was kind of, well, there's going to be a nice province-wide approach, you know, it's going to be consistent everywhere. Let's not duplicate efforts. Let's just wait for the regulations to come. Here we are, and we still don't have regulations. And so we're kind of in this limbo zone, I think, as municipalities of, do we want to continue waiting and defer? Or is there a desire in the interim to have some municipal regulations regulating coastal development? Knowing that if and when the Coastal Protection Act regulations come into force, that the stricter would apply, or that you could discharge yours totally at that point and just rely on the Coastal Protection Act regulations. So I think that's a fundamental question: is it a wait and see, or do we want to have something to bridge the gap in the interim?
Go ahead, Logan. Go ahead.
Thank you. I had a quick question. This came up at our Climate Change Advisory Committee meeting earlier this month. Is there any way to get a draft copy of the regulations that the province had put together that we could use as a framework for our own regulations if we were so chose to go down that road?
So, as far as I know, they have never released the specifics. They have previously kind of talked in broad strokes about where they were going and the challenges that they were having. So their broad stroke approach, and I think it actually modeled on some of the municipalities that already have coastal regulations, was to have a minimum vertical elevation to account for sea level rise. And you have to you calculate that differently depending on where you're in the province. If you're on the Bay of Fundy, it's a lot different than Northumberland Strait, but to have numbers for the whole province. The other thing they were talking about doing was having a horizontal setback from the coast that would be calculated site specifically, that you would have a qualified person, something like, you know, someone trained similar to people who put in septic systems, a qualified person who is trained to use this model, where they would go out and look at your type of coast, you know, is it gravel, is it granite, and calculate the erosion rate and set a horizontal setback based on that. That's probably really challenging for a municipality to do. But that's kind of where they were thinking, as far as I'm aware.
Darla?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that it would be my opinion that we wait for the province. There's a reason it's on hold from the province. It's because it's not politically feasible right now. So, I mean, I think there's a can of worms to be opened if we want to put something in the midterm. But I mean, I think we let this one come from the province. I think that they've already done all the work on it. They just got to implement it. So they're going to do that eventually. So I don't know why we would try to overtake that. It just seems redundant to me. And unpopular.
Is that unanimous?
Any further comments? Go ahead, Robert. Or
Brian just showed me something come out 2 hours ago. Nova Scotia government refuses to release the latest Coastal Protection Act survey results.
Oh, there we go.
And that's probably because they're not what they wanted them to be. But I agree that it's political. Somebody managed to put enough pressure on the provincial government to say, put a halt to that. So I don't disagree with Darla that, you know, for us to redo all this work and almost know that we got organized opposition out there waiting for us, I think we're just digging ourselves a hole. But I hate to see us allow people to build where, again, it's no different than on the interval end. That common sense, you would hope, would say, well, if that fellow tells me we're losing 3 feet a year, you know, and I'm going to build 100 feet, well, I better be prepared that I'm going to lose my place in about 30 years. But that doesn't seem, it's like people almost refuse to believe that that's going to happen. It should be provincial. I think we agreed at the Climate Change Committee that the ideal would be provincial, so everybody has the same rules. You're going to have a patchwork. You know, if we do something and Colchester does something different, that means that, like I said here earlier, just up the coast in Tattamagush or whatever would be a different set of rules. So it's very hard, I think, for us to do it, and we'd probably be jumping into a quagmire similar to agriculture. So we're probably better to leave it alone. I hate to do that because I know that we need something. But I also don't want us to be the victims. I think the province wants us to do it, the municipalities, and take the heat for it. You know, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I suspect that, you know, there's something more up here. There's encouragement almost. I know Lunenburg County, I don't know if any other counties have done it, but I believe Lunenburg may have already implemented some of their own coastal protection measures. Do you know of others that you've worked with that have done it on their own?
Yeah, Lunenburg's doing theirs right now, and they've actually put their whole plan review. They were doing plan. They don't have planning for most of their municipality, and they were doing the whole municipal wide, and they're actually putting that on hold just to focus on the coastal setback issue. So they were working on it. Queens has them. Cumberland has them. I'm trying to think where else. District of Yarmouth, we just finished their plan, and it was one where they are going to wait for the act. Trying to think who else. HRM obviously has them in certain areas.
Sorry, some municipalities have taken a straight up setback approach, have they not, for certain types of structures?
Yeah, it's pretty common. One of the things, like Queens, for example, the approach we went there was to have a vertical elevation for sea level rise, which is fairly straightforward. And then for horizontal to deal with erosion, it was a straight up setback. You know, there's a watercourse setback most of the time, 15 meters from watercourses or whatever it is, and they increase that along the coastline. The challenge with that is if it's a granite coast, it's not eroding at all, and you're probably over-regulating. So there's a bit of, you know, kind of accepting that it's that approach is easy and simple and maybe a bit blunt, but it gets the job done. So we've seen that approach as well. Mahone Bay, we're just wrapping up that, and they're doing a vertical elevation. Town of Lunenburg has them. Yeah.
Well, if you're too
Okay.
low and flat to the water.
You through? No? Question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead, Debbie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not comfortable not doing anything about it, because I think that's kind of passing the buck, too. I know down home, the land is being gobbled up quite quickly, right along the coast in large sections, and they're building right on the water. So, like, it is a huge concern. I know in my area, it's right on the shore, so I hate to see us not do anything with planning, because I think people are expecting us to do something. I know it is, like they say, political suicide, but at the same time, we gotta do something to not let people build there. And I know even people with cottages, they're infilling because the water's coming in and taking away their sand, so they're infilling down there with rocks and all this kind of stuff. And it's totally destroyed the beach, so we do have a concern with what is happening, so I hate to see it set aside.
Peter, go ahead.
Oh, I have to sort of agree with, Darrell and the warden, and that is that if we go and try and put something in there knowing the province is going to come back, then we're going to fight it now. And then when the province puts it on, we're going to be fighting it again. So we're going to be into two fights where I think one would do.
Thank you. Yep, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Deputy Warden Murray. Just further comment to Debbie's point about the land being gobbled up, and it's true that people are, and they're building as fast as they can, putting their homes exactly where they want them, or cottages, before this gets it through. So these houses are already grandfathered in anyways. But I think at the end of the day, like, there is some common sense that has to be held here. And, in the meantime, I think if you're putting your home or putting a cottage or a structure in a place that could be jeopardized, the common sense has to prevail. I do agree that, it would be nice to have some, restrictions, but I mean, our coastline, there is some, while not a lot, there is some diversity in it, and I think that I just feel like, although it would be great to have some protections in, I don't think this should come from us. I think this waterway, Northumberland Strait, is is the water of the province, and I don't think we should have any part of it.
Thank you. Go ahead, Larry.
Thank you. The regulations will be in place by the province somewhere along the line. May not be, it won't be this government, right? A lot of political questions can be answered with one word, and the word is money. A lot of the money that's given to a lot of political parties comes from coastal areas, which is the richest areas in Nova Scotia. So that plays a big political influence on this. But it will be done. I mean, there will be a government will go in that will have the will to do it. And it will have consensus amongst Nova Scotians to have it done as well. So I'm in agreement with leaving it alone for now. I think it'll be done in the next government because public pressure will simply necessitate that it will be done. So I think that as a municipality, we just should stay away until the next election and see what happens, see what transpires from the next election. And if there's no movement then we should reconsider it. But perhaps we should wait for the next government to come in to see what happens. Thank you.
Randy.
Thank you, Deputy Warden. Yeah, I'm similar thoughts there too. My concern is if we regulate the vertical and the horizontal, somebody bought a lot and then they can't build on it because they don't have enough land. So that person might be out. I know a guy just bought a lot down Little Harper Way for $140,000. It's not a very big lot. So that person could be out without building on that lot. It'd be useless. So you never get your money back. If you don't have the common sense not to build there, you got more money than brains. And that's what's happening here. People are just building because they get the money, and that's the people that build there. They get the money, they don't care, we'll deal with it when it happens. But when it happens, then they come crying and saying, oh, it should have been regulated. Well, you've been told that erosion is happening, so I'm under the same thought as most of the councillors here, is that we should look at the province and let them try to regulate it. And then you'll have a consistency throughout the whole province, not having different regulations in different areas. So that's my thoughts.
Thank you. Any further? On to the next then.
All right. Next slide there.
Just before we
Yeah.
move on Debbie's, and I kind of agree with Debbie, actually, that we should be doing something. I don't know what it would be. But is there anything in somebody else's draft that we could look at?
Yeah, in terms of, trying to think if there's any middle ground in terms of what, either you regulate or you don't, I suppose. You could pick and choose whether you could do just horizontal, just vertical, or both. The other thing you can do to soften the blow sometimes is, if there are properties that literally can't be developed, you can have a provision in there that either it's via development agreement and you to choose the least bad spot on the property or whatever it may be. Or, for existing development, allowing them to expand as long as it doesn't make it worse or that kind of thing. You can soften it a little bit in terms of those edge cases of people who, had expectations. But yeah, it's either you have a rule of some kind or you don't, I think, yeah.
So the county wouldn't be liable for issuing a building permit on a place that shouldn't have been.
It's
where common sense, the problem is common sense is getting scarcer.
Yeah, so I'm not your lawyer, and I won't tell you, I won't give you legal advice on whether you're ever liable or not. Typically, kind of the practice that's been said is that municipalities granting permission for something doesn't escape the property owner from dealing with other risks. Permission to build isn't necessarily freeing you from all, saying you're free from all risks. I think, and part of the challenge of these on the municipality side of things or the societal side of things is, common sense. Person's house washes away, they made the bad choice. There is always the worry of now your first responders are at risk, responding at a house being washed away, or that house washes away and hits their neighbor down the way, or the one that comes up, I think the biggest, is people start losing shoreline, and to save their house they armor rock, and that affects the house down the line. So there is that societal concern, I think, on that's the counterpoint to the common sense piece.
Thank you. Dara? Or who is it? Oh, okay. Logan? Oh, you do? Okay. Go ahead, Mary. We'll let him go first.
You can't stop what's going to happen. Nature's going to take its course. You can put up all the walls you want. But should the municipality consider putting a clause into their permits to say that the onus is on the developer, that if something should happen because of erosion and climate change, because they're building near the water, that they're fully responsible for anything that would happen with climate erosion and high tide?
Yeah, I do see that on permits sometimes. I haven't seen it used coastally. I have seen it on inland floodplains in the 1 in 100, where the province allows you to allow some development but have floodproofing requirements. I'll often see municipalities put a on your permit, it basically says, you're in a 1 in 100 floodplain, we're giving you this permit, but like, you can't say you didn't know.
Sewer backflow protection in the city too.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are, yeah, on the permitting side of things, on that communications side of things, so we could, you know, identify the coastal risk zone in these documents, and it would be on a staff side of things in issuing permits in those areas to have that as a comment on the permit, I suppose.
Logan, do you have?
Mary stole what I was going to say. I was going to say we could always require some sort of an indemnification document to accompany a building permit or a development agreement, that type of thing, or even the coastal protection rules around the related to like a site servicing and grading requirements, lot grading and drainage. Put a lot grading and drainage policy or bylaw together, something like that speaks to the retaining walls as well. But the indemnification was what I was going to mention there as well, potentially. Correct. Yeah. Yeah, especially if it comes to the point that they can't get insurance. Like that's what insurance companies are talking about too, no longer insuring these types of properties, and then they may very well come back and try to get something.
Okay, Darrell?
Just a point on that, if you say, you know how sometimes, I don't know what the legalities of it are, but, you know, sometimes if you say, you know, watch your step, then you're drawing attention to the point and you can be held liable because, you know, there's a liability there. I wonder if that's the case, or I think that's a question that we'd have to ask our legal department, just to make sure that sometimes when you know, draw attention to a problem or a liability, you're aware of that liability and it can be cause more liabilities. So just be careful of how we word that, or if we even did it. I think it'd be a question for our legal counsel. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
Peter?
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing Darla just said. I think, you know, when you warn somebody like that, you know what I mean, that there is a potential of this happening, it can fall back on us, because then the same, well, if you knew it, why did you ever let them in the first place? So I think, as Darla said, you should get a hold of a lawyer and check that out.
Mary?
It's not a warning, it's to make them understand that this is a possibility and that you're aware that it could happen, and that if any of those things that we mentioned were to happen, that there's nothing we can do about it to help them.
Okay. Okay, Ian,
Okay.
next step.
And recognizing too that as we get through the engagement phase, you know, this is what we would be bringing as a first attempt, and if we hear differently, we can also change course. So the next one is rural commercial uses. So again, on this one, we don't really have any specific obligation. In the minimum planning requirement regulations, we have to have statements of policy with respect to commercial uses, but it's not specific as to what that means. It's really up to what the municipality needs. So next slide there. You know, kind of, and maybe these are a little more broad than just commercial generally, but some of the key things we heard in the engagement were that people value the rural small town atmosphere, don't want to see too much overregulation of the rural areas, value economic development, but also want to see land use compatibility, that, you know, one neighbor's not ruining the other. So the issue here, I guess, next slide, if you could, is how permissive we are in terms of commercial uses in rural areas broadly. So as we're setting up our zoning structure, as we're establishing zones, you know, each of those zones is going to have a list of uses that's permitted in it: dwellings, agriculture, whatever it is, retail stores, depending on the zone, all those kinds of lists. And we will have some form of rural zone. When it comes to commercial uses, we can kind of go down two routes here. One is we can really have that rural general zone be general, in that it's very permissive, a broad range of commercial uses, and we can still tailor this, but a broad range of commercial uses would just be permitted as of right. You know, that they're listed there. If you meet the setbacks, you meet the lot size, you get your permit, you're good. anywhere in this rural zone. Alternatively, we can be a little more, give a little more guidance, I suppose, and perhaps allow a more restrained list of small commercial uses in that rural general zone, but that if you wanted to have a larger commercial business or a more intensive commercial business, that you would need to have rural commercial zoning. And we would presumably pre-apply that to all the existing rural commercial businesses, and maybe some areas where we want to encourage more rural commercial. But then outside of those areas, if people wanted to have a larger commercial business, they would have to request a rezoning, for example, which would be a process. So, you know, it's on the one hand, option 2 is definitely more restrictive. It's more controlling, but it's also more guiding in terms of where we think it's appropriate to have commercial uses, versus option 1, which is fairly hands-off, let things happen as they happen.
Okay, Larry?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I live in a district that's right on an urban boundary. And there's been instances in my district where we have urban creep. And that creep, and there's some particular other councillors that their districts are close to urban areas as well. So one of the contentious things that happened on the last discussion about land use was there was a tire plant. I live in Abercrombie, which is just up the East River.
Yep.
So just a little background for you. There was a tire plant wanted to go right in the middle of a residential area. And so we had some residents that did not want that, and they went around and got some lists on a name and said, list their names on a list and said, it's not, we don't want this here. So, but the tire plant went ahead and was so there's some commercialization that creeps into residential areas, which was a problem. But also in my district, there's some major industry as well. So in District 8, which is in my district, the pulp mill is in there, and Michelin is in there, right? So those are big industry that you'd have to have some kind of a development agreement for. But just the run-of-the-mill creep that's happening, I think there has to be some kind of consideration given to that, particularly to the districts that are bordered along the urban parts of Pictou County. So I think if you can carve that part out, that would be very beneficial to the people in the district I represent anyway. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. Darrell?
Thank you, Mr. Warden, or Deputy Warden. I guess the issue that I have is the term commercial is very broad, and Larry touched on this a bit. It's very broad. You know, there's a difference between somebody opening up, you know, I live in District 3. So if there's somebody opening up like a boat building shop or you know, something related to, you know, the fishing industry or marine, or a flower shop or a little convenience store is quite different than somebody, you know, moving in with, you know, big industry. So I think it's very hard to paint them all with one brush, you know, especially, you know, I know some districts are having some trouble with campgrounds and that sort of stuff. So I think the challenge here is they're so diverse.
Yeah,
how do you do that?
Which I think is a fair point, and I think that's kind of gets at the heart of the question tonight is, there's a line somewhere, or we can draw a line. We can draw a line where on one side it's like, yeah, we're okay with that. That just happens, and on the other side you need to go through a process or something. You know, you need that higher, stricter hoops to jump through, and some level of control. We can draw that line if we want to, and you know, as we go through this process, we'll figure out exactly where that line is in terms of what's generally okay and what needs some sort of process. I think even before we get there, the big question is, do we want to have a line? Or do we just want to say commercial's fine, period? Or do we want to have a line?
Such like a residential density map that you could have, right, that says that there's this amount of density of residential people, that in that dense of a population, you can't put a tire plant. Or if the density is so, if you could draw a line based on that. So for instance, you know, where I live, the population is a lot more dense than it is on Mount Tom, for instance. So if you could have that as, use that as data points to make your decision, that could be one metric that you could use, like population density.
Okay, go ahead, Darla.
Okay, if I may continue, I think that I think that we are all talking about economic development in this county, and I think that's a buzzword that we all say and that we all want to support. So I think that also ties into this. We want to have opportunity and business and that sort of thing in our county. So how do we facilitate it? Is it through more restriction? Is it through not having a line or having a very light-handed line drawn? So I think that we also need to consider that. I don't think we need to, yeah. I don't know. It's very murky to me. It's not very clear to me what to do here. To protect and then but also facilitate growth. Yeah.
And if I may, generally my recommendation is to have some line, whether it's a thin line or a fairly broadly permissive one. I do recommend having one, partly, you know, from an economic development perspective, is, in my experience, businesses thrive well with certainty, and that, you know, sometimes rules are a burden, but sometimes they also give certainty in terms of like, yeah, I'm in a commercial zone. I can do what I want to do, and I know that, and I chose this land for that reason, or whatever it may be. You know, and I know my neighbors are commercially zoned, and they're not going to petition against my tire shop. But then, you know, and then occasionally you'll have the person who has I already own this piece of land, I want to have a business on it. Oh, you've zoned me residentially. I'm grumpy about that. So that is that two sides of the challenge. But you know, I think having some line and is useful.
If I may continue on that, I think right now in our county, there's areas that we're very intertwined in that. And I think that the line would be very hard to draw in some places, while others that would be very clear.
Okay.
So I think that we have to first decide, going back to my earlier point, what is commercial? Is there different levels? Are we painting everything with one brush? And if so, I guess our next point would be, where does the line begin?
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, Robert, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a difficult one because our people have said in some of those comments, we want to keep this rural setting that we have. We don't want to destroy that. They like the way things are for the most part. Now and then there's situations come up which, you know, they don't like, or some people don't like, but for the most part, people enjoy what we have now, and they've said that very clearly. And many of the small businesses that we have intertwined through all of you can drive anywhere in Pictou County and you'll run across many small businesses that were quite small, but today aren't so small anymore. And somebody set them up off to the side of their building or in front of their yard or whatever, and use our own business example. We started selling a table of plants back 50 years ago. Well, after a while that grew and grew, and you put up some more greenhouses, you did this and you did that, and next thing you had a fairly large business there on the highway with maybe some traffic problems at times and other things. But I think at Huey McGregor's over in Thorburn or Colburn, whatever it is there, you know, started as a small operation after he got home from community college or vocational school at that time, and it grew and it grew and it grew. So suddenly you have a pretty good sized business, not really doing a lot of harm. I don't know the particulars, but Linesbrook Piping and Welding is another good example over here in Linesbrook. Started small, but grew. And so all intertwined in our rural setting here are those type of places. Well, I realize they would all be protected and whatnot, but going forward, I think I agree with Larry. There has to be a line in those, the urban, suburban, I'll call it, versus rural. It's hard to find just exactly where that line is too, but there's a lot more homes, and he talks about density of homes. There's a lot more density of homes than there is in a whole lot of our rural area. So I think we have to, and we said this when we first started talking about minimal planning, we have to treat some of those areas different than we do in Tony River or Lismore. So I think we have to be very careful with this one, and we don't want to inhibit business by putting on restrictions that you can't set up these small shops anymore that grow into, now sometimes when they grow, Gerald Battis would be a good example of his trucking operation. He eventually moved it to, down near Michelin there where it was more industrial. But again, it started as I need room to park my 2 trucks, which became 102. So we have to be very careful not to inhibit small businesses starting in our communities, but somewhere along the line too, there's what they call industrial instead of commercial. Commercial is seen more as sales and that type of stuff, but I think even in the tire one that Larry gave an example of was more industrial, and that's why there was more opposition, I think. But there was talk at the Pictou County Partnership, the former RIN, here back not that long ago, within the last year, of the need for an industrial park. So that if these large industries, like you say, industry doesn't like having to guess what's going to happen. They want certainty. If these larger businesses and the county's trying to attract them and they come and they say to the folks in there, well, show me some places, show me some spots. Well, no, that doesn't have water and sewer. That's not any good. That isn't close to the highway. That isn't any good. So there was a suggestion, I don't think it's gone anywhere at this point, but that somewhere in our county, close to the major highways, we need an industrial park. And people say, well, we already have some industrial parks, but those aren't really what these people are looking for. I think at that time they were looking, and I think was Ferguson, mentioned biochar and that type of stuff, and they were looking for the right place in Pictou County, but they never did find a place, so they went to Debert. They're not that happy there, I understand, but so I think we need to look at things like that so that large industries don't end up plunked in the middle of a suburban or farther out area, and that we have a place. So we want some businesses. We have a place we can offer them. Say, come on out and look at this. This is what we got. It doesn't need to have any buildings or nothing. It's just service land that is large enough pieces of land and close enough to the highway. So I think this covers a lot. This one, and we need to be very careful. All of us we have to be very careful of, but this one can be contentious too. Thank you.
Andy?
So I have the good fortune of representing an area that's very suburban and very rural. And there is a difference between the two. But when you get into the suburban areas, and I'm talking about the areas that are serviced with water and sewer, that our municipalities put millions of dollars in the ground to develop those as a more densely populated area where we could actually subdivide land and create housing that we desperately need. We got to guard against the existing property owners in those areas, in those residential areas, don't deserve to have commercial developments 50 feet from their bedroom window. And that's what's happening now. Great that these fellas want to start a business up, but there's some stuff that just doesn't belong. And until you get the complaints from people that say, what happened here? I moved here, and then all of a sudden there's monster trucks in my neighbor's yard, and they're firing them up all hours of the night. Until that happens to you, you'll never understand, because I'm dealing with residents that are very meek and mild, and they're arguing with their neighbors now. And it's a horrible thing to see this happen in your own community. So we need to come up with some reasonable rules around our serviced areas, especially because we have skin in the game as a municipality. We provide them with services. Those are your densely populated areas. Nobody would want what my neighborhood's going through right now. It's horrible. So, and then on another note, when this whole planning process started, I had a resident who lives in the new subdivision send me a terse email saying, "What's this about planning in the county?" It was basically the tone of it, and it sounded like he wasn't really much for it. And I said, "Well, it's like this. We're trying to create a set of rules similar to what you signed as a protective covenant to go in that subdivision. There's certain things that are not allowed to do in that subdivision. And that's what we need to wrap our heads around for these serviced areas of Pictou County. I mean, even the further out areas, there's some regulation required, because I have commercial operations in my areas that's very upsetting to rural people. You do not want to have a scrapyard next to you. Could you imagine if in Little Harbor, they wouldn't do it down there because that's the worst use of the land down there, but if they set up a scrapyard in the middle of Little Harbor, somebody on your main road, like, we have to come to terms that there's certain rules that we have to protect our property taxpayers in Pictou County. Those people get impacted directly by their main investment in their life is their house. And if the activity that's going on around them, whether it's a junkyard or a mechanic shop in somebody's backyard or whatever it might be, if that's impacting their ability to sell their property, we've negatively impacted their investment in that property by not having proper rules for the whole county. So, like, to do it here and we'll just ease off everywhere else, I think we're doing a disservice to all the residents of Pictou County if we don't come up with some better rules so we can all get along in our communities.
Thanks, Andy. Randy?
Should have let me go before Robert and Andy, because now I forget what I was going to say. Now, anyway, turn back clock. I got her now. So my area is 80% of it is service, probably, right? And it's got some commercial now, mostly residential. So I agree with Robert and Andy. Like, we put a lot of investment in our services. So those are places where I can see we address the housing issues, right? But I also see in my area, it was like the ward mentioned about McGregor's Machine Shop. It started off as a small family business. Now they have over 200 employees. So that stretch of my area, I could see zoned as commercial residential. But most of the other areas would be called residential, right? As you get out further, then it'd be more of a general zoning, because you're into big lots and things like that. Homes are a lot further apart, like that's probably 20%. But I agree, we gotta have some protection in there for our residents, like in Thorburn there, I mentioned this before, that this guy opened up a sawmill selling wood. Like, he was sawing wood all the time, right in the middle of the village on a quarter of an acre lot. So, you know, we got to protect the residents from that. But we don't want to stop the commercial, but we got to have a place for the commercial. We got to have a place for residential. And with our investment in water and sewer, that's where we address the housing. So, and like you're saying, there's a farm that's no longer being used in my area, but it's gonna be in a service area where there's water and sewer, which has potential. And the land's not much good for farming. You had cattle and things like that, but you never really farm that land. So that could be like his retirement part, right? So, anyway, that's all I have to say. Don't think I forget anything, but.
You can tell us later.
Thanks, Randy. Any other comments? Okay, you got enough on that one?
Yeah, I'm hearing that we're comfortable with a line somewhere, establishing lines, and as we go through this process, we'll take a stab at, what's too big, and we'll work on that as we go through these drafts with you. So, okay, next one. Parks, Trails, and Recreation. We heard a fair bit about this in the engagement, particularly people how much they value recreational opportunities and access to nature, and that it's probably one of the key reasons for living in MOPC. Actually, is that came up highly in the surveys, and of course, in a rural municipality context, recreation provision's a little different than, say, in a town. And in many cases, it's left to you recreate on your own land or crown land or whatever it is. And when it comes to the planning documents, there's not a whole lot that the documents themselves will ultimately do when it comes to recreation. We'll recognize the importance of it and the value of it, and we'll probably have a conservation zone or a parks and open space zone that applies to provincial parks and that kind of thing. But these documents don't generally direct recreation investment or anything like that. There is one key policy thing that where municipal planning documents tie into parks and recreation, and that is parkland dedication. So municipalities in Nova Scotia, as part of the subdivision process, so when land is subdivided, have the power to require that the subdivider provide land or cash in lieu of that land for public purposes, which is open space or parks and open space. The idea being, if you're creating a subdivision, that there would be public recreational lands in there for those residents. In the rural context, in a rural municipality context, the land piece of it usually gets more challenging. It's very rare that you're having a If you're having it's rare that you're having a 200 property subdivision. It's probably a couple here, a couple there, and the land ends up being a tiny little park that, as a municipality, you don't want to have to maintain. So I frequently see rural municipalities do cash in lieu instead of the land, unless it's sometimes I see criteria for, like, if it's on a water course, we'll take land so that there's a public boat launch or something like that. And then the cash in lieu goes into a pot that you use to acquire land where you want it or to improve land that you have for parks purposes. The municipalities are allowed to do up to 5% of the subdivision as public open space, or up to 10% if the municipal planning strategy gives reasons why. So this is a key policy tool that you can have if you want to support the municipality's parks and recreation efforts. It is a cost on subdivision, ultimately. And you can also exempt certain classes of subdivision from a requirement. Like if I'm cutting off a lot to give to my kid, we can exempt those 1 and 2 lot subdivisions or whatever it is. But it's, I guess, first a question of whether that's a tool you want to use at all. Yeah, you can write criteria in of what land you're willing to accept, or the situations where you'll take land over cash. You want to make sure if you're taking land that it's usable for some important purpose, and it's not just the worst piece of land in the subdivision that the developer doesn't want anyways. So, yeah, I guess first of all, is it is there an appetite at all to use the subdivision process as a tool to acquire resources for public open space?
Any comments on that? Who would point at you? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is something that might work in the city, but I don't think that this municipality should be looking at it, because we want the development to happen, right? And somebody that's development sees this as another tax. We're a rural municipality, we have all kinds of recreational space and everything like that, and I just don't think that we should implement something like this in our planning, so. I think you'll deter a lot of people from building and might be looking elsewhere, so.
Robert?
Oops, no. I agree with Randy on that one. I don't think it's something we need here. You know, we've got lots of land for recreation and trails and whatnot, if we just gotta get people's agreement on some things. What I wanted to bring up under this one, I guess be under recreation in particular, we've had numerous incidents in this county, and I know one in Lions Brook, where people have traditionally had recreation area, you know, that they were able to use, whether it was along the river or whether it was, you know, on the shore, that was a community trail down to that beach and, or down to the river. I know the one in Lions Brook, it was simply, the government put it up for sale, what was along what was going to be a lake here, the Lions Brook Lake or whatever. One time that was going to be water for some of the towns, but that was changed and no longer, so the government decided to sell it all off. Well, when they sold off some of that land, it was, I don't know, maybe 50 or 100 feet wide, but all of a sudden the trail that had been used all the time to get down to the water for swimming and other recreation was cut off, because that owner said, no, not crossing my land anymore. This is mine now, you can't cross it. So I think there's something needs to be looked at, and I know I've heard on the news all kinds of other areas where people have closed off parts of the beach, you know, and so I think we need to, they come to us as counselors, or they go to their MLAs or whatever and say, what can you do? This is a community, this has been a community place, and now, you know, because somebody new bought the land, and they said, no, not anymore. So the person who was there all along was fine with it, but that was over generations and generations. So I don't know if there's any way that can be worked into a plan. You can't tell the person who owns the land, you know, what to do, but I don't know what you can tell them, but that's a concern of mine anyway.
So, actually, so as a municipality, you know, we can't necessarily say you can't close that old right-of-way, or that what people used as a right-of-way. But this is actually one of those tools in some instances where, as a municipality, someone's buying up a piece of land along a water course, and they are subdividing it, and they're going to sell off lots. If that subdivision happens and we have public space dedication, if we have the criteria in there, we could say that subdivision, as your land dedication, you need to give us that public access to that water, that where they exist, we're gonna take that as public land, and it's not gonna solve every instance. If I bought a big piece of land that was used as a house and I keep using it as a house, but I decide to cut off that trail, that's not gonna fix those instances. But it is a tool in those instances where I buy the piece of land and I want to create a bunch of cottage lots. If I subdivide, and we have this tool, that could kick in there.
But is there anything in the planning documents that can, you know, so where something's been used for 100 years, 50 years, there's no way if somebody else buys that strip of land as they did, they can cut, because I look at the land we got in the recreation, people, there's more and more money people, they call them, buy up the waterfront areas, then there's less and less recreation area for the rest of us. You know, just want to go down and have a swim.
Yeah.
But maybe that's beyond what our planning document can do.
Logan, go ahead.
Thank you, Deputy Warden. I wanted to touch on this because some items related to this have come up with our department over the past couple of months. One is in Darla's district on Caribou Island Road, in Caribou Island, in which there's a beach that's been used for ages. It's made the news. People have heard about it. The RCMP were called at different times. I can appreciate council's, if council chooses that they want to not get involved in this, and it's a deterrent to development, things like that. But I wanted to sort of raise the point that it could be a useful tool in some context, maybe with caveats around it. If there's a special interest in a certain area that one in Darla's district, it was about cutting off access to the beaches. People weren't allowed, new owners weren't allowing people to access this beach. And then they went through and they did a subdivision of multiple lots. And the municipality, had we had this type of tool, could have then said, hey, we're not going to take 5% of your land or something like that, but a strategic access to the beach for the people around that have used it for 100 years would still be of value. There's another one in Mary's district. Forget their names. Came up at the meeting. Yeah. So I mean that's another one that's been there's been an access to a beach that people have used for ages, and then new owners come in and they don't want to use it anymore. So it's a mechanism that maybe there's a way to work it in with caveats, so it's only used in certain contexts and is deferred otherwise or something like that. But I do think that there's a benefit to having some way to resolve those issues. Maybe it's not through a dedication, but these issues that we've run into over and over again, where people are asking the municipality, what can you do to help solve these things? And we say, we don't have anything that we can use at this point. It can be used for trail connectivity if we have things like disagreements on easements for trail usage with our trails groups and stuff like that. Maybe there's an opportunity there too. So I just wanted to raise that as not to deter in any way development, but is there a way to use it as a tool to help enhance other things that we're trying to do in the areas? Thanks.
Thanks, Logan. Mary?
It's not turning people off from development if there's nothing in place, but if you put something in place, it very well could. And I think that the people who have the issues are the people who didn't have it on their deed. If you actually really have a right-of-way to water, it will be on your deed and you'll have access. Anything else is just word of mouth. And I don't think passing that on to someone who's actually buying land and taking part of it to say so-and-so is going to pass through your property is going to help. I think it's going to make them say, like, forget it. I'll go find someplace else so that I don't need to put up with that. I wouldn't want anybody passing through my property if I bought it and they just said, well, for years we've done this. Well, I wouldn't be able to do it.
Did you get that in the notes? Go ahead. Go ahead, Darla.
And District 3, thank you. It's a very double-edged sword with that because I can see both sides of it, and to me it is a legal issue. If you own a piece of land and you want to give the community right away, or you want to let people go, that's make an easement. But at the same time, it may deter if down the road then you want to sell it, that you may have a hard time selling it because people don't want to have that right away. So, I can see, both sides of it. I don't think we should be into taking land and saying, well, we're going to use that land, so we're going to take it. I think the province did a terrible job of that. Look at Lions Brook, for example, took land and what did they use it for? In the process of giving it back, right? I think that's overreach. I think there are specific cases where, it would be helpful to possibly have something. There's always going to be one-offs. And where even if you have similar cases, it may work in one and not the other. So I think we have something that's more broad, if anything, because with property, there's even they might look similar, but there's never two of the same on paper. even two lots side by side, sometimes they could be very different with access and easements and all that stuff. So I don't know. I can see both sides of it, but I think it's, again, opening a can of worms. For property's very tricky in that sense. So, yeah. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mary.
One of the things that come along with that too is, do you want pets in your area and on your beach? People littering, dog doo-doo, garbage, people not being responsible and coming in and they act like it's theirs because they have that right of way to get to it, but they don't treat it responsibly like the people that actually have that right of way. So that's one of the big things.
Thank you. Any further comments on that? Okay, Ian?
Okay. Down one more, down one more. Okay, parking. So again, there's no obligation or anything from a provincial policy point of view when it comes to parking, but we are empowered as municipalities to regulate the requirement of parking. We can, if we want to, require developments to provide on-site parking. And we can do that in some cases or all cases or none if we want. So that would be like, if you have a store, you have to provide one parking space for every X number of square feet or whatever it may be, parking minimums. The idea being that when development happens, it provides enough parking to keep people from parking, from parking on neighboring streets and impacting the wider neighborhood. I think in a rural context, it's probably less necessary. I'd have a stronger discussion of this in a town, for example, than in a rural municipality. But it is an option if it's something we want to regulate. And we can regulate it differently. We could have parking requirements in serviced areas and not in rural areas, or vice versa. But I wanted to get a sense on that before we go one way or another with any sort of parking requirements. If it's a need at all, or if we just leave it out and keep it simple.
Any comments? Go ahead, Robert.
A while back, I would have said that we don't need parking in rural areas, we don't need regulations on parking. But I found out in our own business that as the business got busier and busier, especially on the weekends, we didn't have enough parking space, so people parked up and down both sides of the road. And that suddenly got very dangerous for the people crossing the road, carrying plants or whatever, and people trying to get through, and big trucks were on a fairly busy road. Became very dangerous to the point where the RCMP came to visit us and said, you're going to have to do something about this. Well, the first move was to get everybody to park on the same side of the road, and that wasn't easy, but we eventually got there. But it was still very dangerous. I didn't want somebody getting killed in front of our business because we didn't have enough parking space, what it came down to. And so we did, level off a big area and increase the parking enough. And on top of that, we put a place in town so that people were going two places, not just one place. You do what you have to, but all of a sudden I learned that parking was vitally important. If you're only having a couple customers at the time, depending on the type of business you have, ours was very seasonal, so everybody came at the same time on the weekend. But we have those spotted around the county for sure, and some have enough parking and some don't. But it seems like a waste of land when you're building it. I remember when we put out the place in New Glasgow, they came along, they had very firm rules, and you're gonna have to have this much parking space. I thought, you crazy? You're taking up 2/3 of my space with parking. I need it for other stuff. But all of a sudden, on the weekend it was full. So you needed it. So I think it's something we can't turn a blind eye to, because if we want to have, especially more so maybe in the suburban areas again, where we draw that line, but we're not in a suburban area and we ran into that problem. So I think it's a good idea to have something in there or you do run, what you run into is parking on the road. The schools have the same problem. They're all over the road on graduation night or any other big event going on. You go out to West Pictou, we have a couple little parking lots we saved, but, you know, it'll be lined up on both sides of the road out there. But that's, you know, 2 or 3 times a year. But for a business, you know, setting up in the future may be something to consider. Thank you.
Thank you. Debbie?
Yeah, my situation down home probably doesn't really fall under this category, but it's a lot of cottage roads. And they don't have a lot of wiggle room or a lot of parking room, so they do block the roads. So like, if they need a fire truck, this sort of thing, they can't get down the roads. Would something like planning be able to help situations like that?
Yeah, so we could require that dwellings, which, you know, a cottage would fall under, that they have at least one parking space or more if we wanted to, which might be getting heavy-handed. We could require it. In those kind of legacy areas where there's undersized lots, it could also be a challenge, and then, like, I literally don't have the space to provide that spot. But yeah, if we wanted to, we could require that new development anyways. It wouldn't apply to old development.
No.
But new development going forward, that they provide at least a parking space on their lot.
Okay, good, thank you.
Okay, any further comments? Get enough feedback on that one? Something
Not
to
a strong
work with?
feeling one way or another generally, but we'll work with it.
Okay.
Nearing the end here.
Don?
If I could just speak for a moment about Big Island.
Sure.
With the armored rock portions that have come in the last few years, the parking lot has sort of disappeared, and people are parking along the side of the road, and it's quite dangerous for residents of the island or anyone really who is traveling the road to have all these parked cars along the sides of the road. I don't know if there's anything we can do to address that.
Not likely when that's a public.
Yeah, no, like this would be for what, you know, whenever private development happens, if we were, you know, when they come for their permit, if we're requiring them to have parking spaces. I think for those, you know, public beaches and that kind of thing, that's more of a operational issue with whoever is responsible for that access point.
Go ahead, Darrell.
I guess I'm thinking about this. Wouldn't that, how do you do that? Like, you can't go by square footage because it may be a low traffic business. And you can't go by, you know, I guess, how do you choose what is the best parking ideal number for a business? How do you go about that?
Yeah, so it's usually by business type, like you classify type of business, restaurant versus retail versus office, you know, have broadly different needs.
Mm-hmm.
It is blunt to some degree that, like, I mean, the one that ruins it all is always Tim Hortons. You know, like the difference between Tim Hortons as a coffee shop and the Crow Place in Stellarton as a coffee shop, their traffic needs are very different. So yeah, it's blunt to a degree, and I think as part of that, you're recognizing that you're not going to accommodate all parking needs in the worst case scenarios, because if you do that, you just get a sea of parking that's expensive to build, takes up all your land, and no one uses it.
Right.
So it's a kind of like, how much do we need to deal with most of the problem? And there's those fringe, there's that outlier restaurant that has way higher traffic, or there's that one day a year where it's really busy because of graduation or whatever, and we just accept that that's going to be messy.
Was this a concern that was raised at all by anyone?
No, it's just that this is a common.
Just something, it's like a filler. It's something that's in every one of the plans.
Most land use bylaws in Nova Scotia have it. And I don't know if they all need to. And I wanted to get a sense one way or another.
Well, do you think we need to?
No.
Okay. But there you go.
All right.
All right.
And if there's no
So
strong.
moving on.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to check in first. All right.
Okay.
Next slide. Regional cooperation. Okay, so there are now engagement program requirements regulations in Nova Scotia. And those regulations require that you, as a municipality, solicit comments from abutting municipalities when adopting a municipal planning strategy or amending one. We've sent out letters to the neighboring municipalities as part of this process. But this would be a policy for going forward. So if you amend your municipal planning strategy, you are required to have a framework for engaging with adjacent municipalities. And there's certain criteria that have to be fulfilled, like that engagement has to deal with the statement's provincial interest. There has to be a way for council to consider those comments, and that engagement has to happen before you give first reading or before you advertise the public hearing. But there is some wiggle room in there for when you engage. It doesn't have to be all amendments. You can have some parameters around when you're going to engage with neighboring municipalities or not. So you could say we're going to engage with neighboring municipalities on every plan amendment. You know, if we're changing our municipal plan, we're going to reach out to our neighbors. You could say we're only going to do it if it's within, you know, if you set criteria, maybe it's an X distance from their border because it might affect them. Or, you know, ones that I commonly see are like, if it's an amendment that might affect the water supplies because the town's water supplies are in the municipality, they might have an interest in how you're changing the plan around that water supply, for example. So I guess the first question is, do you want to just reach out to your neighbors on all amendments, municipal planning strategy amendments, or do you want to establish some sort of criteria for when you reach out or not?
Any comments? I would say just when we need to.
Just when you need to. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would agree. I think, you know, if there has to be a reason why we're reaching out to somebody, right? It's same as we'd reach out to a homeowner if they were affected, right? If something's happening in Plymouth, they're not reaching out to me in Caribou saying, hey, do you know about the, you know, this happening? I think it has to be kind of common sense forward that if it could possibly lead to a conflict or an issue, I think they need to be included. But I mean, do we need to reach out to the town of Trenton every time something happens in River John? I don't think so. Like, that just doesn't make sense to me. Thank you.
Randy?
I can see reaching out to them for situations where we're going to impact them. Say if we're going to have a development that's going to run into their town, it's going to impact their streets and things like that, and also their water, because we do have a water utility with them. So if we're doing anything that might impact that, we should give them a heads up to let them know, you know, this is what we're looking at, maybe down the road or whatever, and just see that we can iron things out before things get too far down the road. So, yeah.
Larry?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess there has to be some criteria set in terms of when we need to, quote unquote, when we need to. Now, it could be considerably different viewpoints on that from when we say we need to and when the adjacent municipality feels that they should have been consulted. I mean, you know, there could be, our opinion and their opinion could be quite divergent. So I think there has to be particular criteria set of when we do reach out to them.
Yeah, and absolutely, that would be part, like, even just meeting this provincial requirement, it does need to be explicit about when you do or don't. It's not because we felt like it. Yeah, distance or proximity, I think, is a big one. Whether it's going to affect their services or not is probably pretty common. And I should say too, the other thing is when we have a public draft, we will be following up with adjacent municipalities to let them know there's a public draft of these documents, and one of the things they'll be able to review is what those criteria we've set are, and they can let us know if they would like, you know, if they think it's not enough or too much. Yeah, so I think proximity, affecting services are big ones. Trying to think if there's any like shared shared initiatives that you have that we may want to with towns or other municipalities, surrounding municipalities. that would be affected by planning. What's that? Sorry, say that? Business park?
Robert?
We have our water utility, or our water utility that ties into water utilities from other municipalities. Sewer, we have a shared sewer treatment plant with Pictou and a shared one with the Upper East River towns. So those would be certain items that should probably make their way, should be considered at least. Those are probably the key ones, I would say. Those are a key piece of infrastructure. We don't have any active transportation mapping or anything like that common at this point, I don't think. There's some talk about that.
Robert?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we need to consult with the 5 towns here, but we also border on Antigonish, and we border on Colchester up at the other end, and Halifax, I believe, somewhere. So all of those we consult with. My question involves Pictou Landing First Nation. Do we have different requirements to consult on everything versus some things with Pictou Landing First Nation?
Yeah, it's different. They're not included in this engagement program requirements regulations. There is no requirement there from this. You can choose to set a policy for yourself of when you do that.
There is no requirement to consult with Pictou Landing First Nation on anything we're doing here.
No.
It's different than with the sewer in Salem, which was a long ways away from Pictou Landing. We were faulted because we didn't consult with Pictou Landing First Nation.
It's a jurisdictional thing. Land use planning is provincial. First Nations are federal. That's the trigger on infrastructure projects. If there's federal money in it, it can trigger a consultation because it has federal money.
So there's
that's the difference.
On any of this, there's no need to consult. It does say Pictou Landing First Nations in here, where it lists the 5 towns. It lists Pictou Landing First Nations in here, but there is no obligation to consult.
There's no obligation, but you may want to set that obligation for yourself.
Okay, I understand that.
And recognizing that in many cases it will be, First Nations are consulted with a lot, and that's a lot of burden on their half to respond to all of it, because there's been a kind of flipping of the pendulum in that we, for sewer projects and everything, there's a lot of consultation that happens. And very often that, as Brian mentions, that relationship with First Nations is at a federal level. But certainly as a courtesy, that you may want to have that for yourself, for sure.
Chester?
Thank you. I know you were talking about that one thing and another, but the utility board, if we're gonna do anything, they're gonna do it anyway. So it would come under them then, instead of us being, well, if something to, I'm gonna give you an example. Years ago in Riverton, we used to buy water from the town of Stellarton at the cost of maybe $15,000 a year. The utility board, they put a new water system in the river that runs down from District 11 and 12. And now we pay $300,000 a year for the same water because the utility board made that decision.
Yeah.
So what are we bothering having anything to do with it, because they're gonna pencil it in the way they want anyway?
So, yeah, this would be in situations, so for example, where this might come up. Say you have the town of New Glasgow water supplies in the municipality. If you got a plan amendment request that they wanted to open, someone was applying to amend the plan to make the area industrial right next to the town's water supply, there's a situation where they're probably going to have an interest in that and want to have a say. And in those cases, you would be consulting with the neighboring or with New Glasgow in that case on that planning application, that amendment to your plan for industrial purposes next to the water supply. You'd be getting their input because they're probably going to have feelings on that.
Thank you. Well, the town of New Glasgow's got a watershed all around and the biggest farm in Pictou County is on its shoulders all the way around, pretty much. But anyway, I just wanted that kind of clarified, okay?
Yep.
Okay, Mary, go ahead.
If nothing is implemented, does that mean it's still open for discussion if someone had to reach out to someone for a reason? Would that still exist?
So you have to have a policy for, it's a requirement of the engagement program requirements regulations that you have to have a policy for when you consult with neighboring municipalities.
Specifically, or can it just be an open, they will be contacted on an as-needed basis?
No,
for
it's
the-
got to be specific. Like, it's not so the whim of the council of the day. It's got to be, you're setting it now. You're setting what your specific situations of when you're going to engage with neighboring municipalities.
So it's better to have more than less, so that you cover all your bases then?
Yeah, if you want.
If you never have to use it, so what?
Yeah, so it would be so on a staff level, if you got a planning application that affected whatever those criteria set, if it's 1,000 meters from a town boundary, if that application is within that area, and the policy says you're going to consult with neighboring municipalities within 1,000 meters, then when that application came in, you'd be sending a letter to that municipality that said, hey, we've got this application, here's the details of it, let us know if you have any comments. So if it meets that criteria, you'd be sending the letter. Doesn't mean they feel the need to respond, depends, but they would be getting that letter if you have an application that meets whatever criteria we set.
Peter?
I was just wondering, did you send any yet from any municipality to the government on this
Sorry,
study?
say again?
Did you send anything in on a municipality yet to the government for any of the municipalities you've been working for?
Oh, in terms of plans to get
Yeah.
signed off on, yep.
And is the government generally in, cooperation, or are they sending them back and saying, no, you got to do more here?
I have not had one returned yet.
Okay.
What we often do with these plans is we'll send them in, when we get the first public draft, we'll send them informally to the province. They've been really good to us in terms of giving us informal comments ahead of time. So we have gotten comments back saying, hey, your current draft has got a gap when it comes to floodplains has been the big one recently, or some comments about agricultural, and this is just an advisory, you might want to address this, and we'll address it. And then when it comes to the actual formal review after council's adopted it, we haven't had one sent back yet, so.
Okay, Robert?
I just wanted to ask, we're required to consult. So let's say we're gonna build something just outside of Pictou's line here, and, they say, well, no, we don't like what you're gonna do, whatever. Do we have to stop, or do we just say, well, thanks for your input, but we're going ahead anyway?
So first of all, this would only be for amendments to the plan. So if it was development that was already enabled in the zoning, or if it was a rezoning or a development agreement, like those lower level things, this would only be if you're changing the big plan, like fundamentally changing direction. You have to have a mechanism for council to consider their comments, but there is no explicit obligation there that you have to. You could say thank you very much. Great, we're doing what we're doing. If you want to, and then the politics of it all come in. But yeah.
Larry?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Have all the public consultations finished?
For this,
Yeah,
just the first round.
first round.
Yeah. So when
Does the second round start?
whenever after the first draft goes out, we'll have a whole second round where we get into the nitty gritty with people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, will you have different areas that were missed in the first round?
We've talked about that preliminary, but yeah, I think the intention is that we'd have another round of 6 meetings that would we'd flip to the areas that we didn't hit the first
Yeah,
time
because
around.
there has been some particular areas that
Yeah.
would be interested in this that weren't met
Yeah,
in the first set.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the plan.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good
go
on,
ahead.
so last one is And this wasn't in the report that we sent around. I kind of thought of it this morning while I was putting the presentation together. Sorry, a couple more, one more, sorry. Is accommodations. This didn't really come up in engagement so much, but it's one that ultimately, I thought of it today because I'm dealing with it in Yarmouth. It comes up a lot at the end when we get into the nitty gritty of accommodations. So we in Nova Scotia now have a updated Tourist Accommodations Act that says no person shall within the province carry on the business of conducting, maintaining, operating, or managing a roofed accommodation unless there is, in respect of such accommodation, a license. So basically you have to register tourist accommodations in the province now. As part of this act also, they've kind of done away with a lot of the different categories of accommodations. It used to be that you had hotels, motels, bed and breakfasts. They've kind of lumped, the lines are blurred these days with hotels advertise on Airbnb and all those kinds of things. And they've done away with a lot of that terminology. And so if we're looking at accommodations. The other piece of this is that the tourist accommodations registration regulations say that a host, so when you go to register your accommodations, you have to confirm that you comply with applicable municipal land use bylaws. So we do have the power, as part of all of this, to say where it's appropriate to have accommodations or not. And we always have. It's just that the tool, it got really blurry when Airbnb entered the fray. I was just using my dwelling to have some guests. That's all very clear now that we have this act. Those are accommodations. We can regulate them. We'll have data to do it if we want to. So I think the big questions that come up with accommodations are twofold. One is the larger standalone accommodations. I'm running this as a business. I've built a hotel, or I've built 6 cabins, or I've got yurts, or what's the big one? The glomes, the glamping domes. There's kind of that tier, and then there's the Airbnb, VRBO, renting out your home tier of accommodations. And we can regulate where either of those are appropriate or not. We could just say they're appropriate everywhere, or we can be specific in how we want to allow both standalone accommodations and accommodations in your home. What I commonly see done is that standalone accommodations require some sort of commercial zoning or what have you. It always becomes a question in rural areas. I want to run my gloam business with 5 gloams in the rural areas, and I don't want to have to go through rezoning. But we also hear conflicts about campgrounds and that kind of thing. And then the other question is, kind of the Airbnb style renting out of homes. I often see a restriction on limiting that to your primary residence, that you're not buying up houses and Airbnb-ing them. So we can do that, but we don't have to. This wasn't something that came up in engagement a lot. I don't have a good sense of how much of an issue it is. I'd be curious to hear from you as councillors when it comes to challenges or not with accommodations in your districts, and whether we just want to let it happen or whether we do want to have some parameters.
Go ahead, Mary.
When you were reading that, you kept saying they. Is that the Tourist Association that did that? The province? Who is they? That's
the province.
they.
Yeah. The they is that there's now a new provincial act. Yes.
Go ahead, Debbie.
The biggest concern I've heard down my way is like bed and breakfasts have to be registered.
Yeah.
Airbnbs do not, and there's a lot of concern that there's a conflict there for the people that are running the bed and breakfast.
And so that has now changed, that Airbnbs also have to be, that's what this new Tourist Accommodations Act achieves, is that if you are running any sort of accommodations, you have to register. But if there's that's a one-time thing, it's $50, and if there's no municipal rules, then it's not Okay, you pay your $50 and you get your registration and that's it. What the registration really does is it provides a mechanism that if municipalities want to regulate them, now we know where they are. So that requirement is there now. It's a question of whether you want to take advantage of it to regulate them or just leave as is.
Andy's first there, right?
Just, do you have any sense of how many Airbnb accommodations are in Pictou County? Is there like, I know in Halifax they've clamped down on, and this would be our opportunity to do some type of correction, I guess we'll call it. Do we have any sense of how much of an issue it is?
Honestly, I don't. And that's one of the challenges. I don't have a sense
So
of it.
how do you get that information?
There are, there are services, Air DNA, that, actually, I have one question. Did the housing needs assessment dig into that at all? I should ask Ryan. Ryan wrote it, so I will check with Ryan and see if we have that, we may have that data, actually.
Ryan might have an answer for that here.
I don't think it's come through very much. I'll check the individual comments again. I looked at it today.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
province will provide us a number
Yeah.
of accommodations. So they'll provide us the number that they have registered.
Yeah.
So we just passed the marketing levy
Okay.
in November. So that agreement is working its way through provincial sign-off and things like that. So I actually got the email from them yesterday saying they won't give us the breakdown of who's actually registered yet because the agreement has to be signed by the minister before they'll actually do the data sharing, but they will provide us a number
Okay.
of accommodations.
Interesting.
And then we'll, once the agreement is signed up by the province, they'll give us specific that it's Robert Parker business doing it type things.
And that's the kind of data that in HRM, they've now made it the rule that you can only have accommodations in commercial zones or in your primary residence. So I can't rent out my house, my second house. I can't even build a backyard suite and rent that out. It's got to be in my house. And the province will share that data with HRM if they want to go enforce. They can look and say, this one's registered. That's not a commercial zone. It's not somebody's private residence, and they can enforce if they want to. So that data is now available.
Andy, you want to follow up on that?
Just on that, I know they had a horrific fire up in Montreal with an Airbnb that was not properly, there was no egress and there was people that died in the fire. There was multiple Airbnbs in this one place. Is there anything that will trigger a fire inspection of some place that wants to be rented out as an Airbnb, or does that just happen like on new home construction? But if you're renting a place out, shouldn't there be some type of inspection by fire and all that stuff? And
We have a system of inspection, so as long as it met that criteria, the fire inspector could
Yeah.
inspect. But it's set by policy.
It's set by policy, but it is, like, there's nothing triggering, if I decide I'm gonna rent out my house, what's triggering, and I think it's good enough as is, is there anything that's gonna trigger me, getting an inspector by my house saying, I hear you're gonna rent this place out, we gotta take a look at it? Is there anything, or is it the Wild West? I guess it's the best way to put it.
So I don't know when fire requirements change. When do they up the requirements for fire separation, that kind of thing. If we are silent on, if we're silent on accommodations, and there's no need, for example, to come in and get a development permit to change to an accommodations use, we'll never know. If we're saying that you need to come to us to get your permit so that you can get your provincial registration, there's a permit there, we know that there's accommodations. And whether or not a fire inspection's needed, I'm not sure, but at least then we know.
We've been fire inspections, sorry, is that what you're gonna say?
It's defined by occupancy.
Okay.
So it's the occupancies that are contained in the Fire Act, Fire Safety Act.
Only thing that is, how are you gonna know that I started a Airbnb in my house? How are we gonna know that?
I guess probably the answer to that is if you're staying in that house and you're only renting it out every second weekend, if it's safe for you, it's safe for your, the renter, right? That's probably the simplistic view, but so it is defined kind of by occupancy load. Now it might get there is a business and personal services occupancy D, group D. It might get captured there as a business
Yeah,
type thing. So
that's where I wonder when it crosses over into that. I'm not
yeah,
sure.
so it might get triggered there. So
I think from a land use bylaw perspective, in terms of regulating accommodations, kind of the key, the reasons municipalities usually do it is A, whether there's concerns about compatibility. You hear, well, do I want a cottage business next to me where people are coming and going? Maybe we don't care, maybe we do. And then the other one is impact on housing stock. If there is a problem where houses are being bought up and being turned into accommodations because it's more profitable to charge $200 a night than $1,000 a month or whatever, and that's actually impacting available housing, that's when I see municipalities get concerned as well. So.
Larry?
Most of the questions I have been answered on this, regarding this, but does it change the category of taxation? If you have an Airbnb, if you have a principal residence and you change it into a business, do we capture that here and change the tax category at all?
no.
No.
No, I don't, if it's your principal residence and you're using it as an Airbnb, it's still your principal residence.
But it's also a business.
It's a commercial, but they did away with occupancy. So like apartment buildings are classed as residential, they're not commercial in nature, so it doesn't really change the tax.
Okay.
But if you built 5 glomes on your property as a standalone, those are going to be rented out as tourist accommodations, then
Yeah.
that could get captured.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any further? Robert?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Probably of all the ones we've talked about tonight, this is the one I've heard the least about in the people I know in the public. But maybe there's some good reason to have some of this information. If you were gonna do something, you had to come in and get a permit, at least we know who's doing it. But not, I don't think any hard regulations, just to know who's doing it. But you mentioned that, you can only have it as part of your principal residence. Is that just in Halifax or is that everywhere?
Halifax is the one that they most recently, they made that big change, and that was a big deal. There are other municipalities that limit it to only your personal residence or commercial zoning, but HRM's the big one.
Because I know people around here that have built brand new homes.
Yeah.
For renting out this way.
Yeah.
And where those ones are located, where they built them, they're quite a ways away from everybody. But I can see, you just mentioned there's something that kind of clicked me in on that sort of all-night parties for in there, because people are going there for the weekend to have a good time. There's 3 or 4 couples coming, and they rent the place for the weekend. It's no different than having a sawmill next to you after a while. If you've got, other than they well,
What kind of parties do you go to, Robert?
they at least go home. The sawmill doesn't go home. But there's potential for problems. But I don't know in this county, can we still build new houses for, for that purpose, or, B&B or whatever, or is that allowed? I don't know. But that potential is there if that was suddenly in the middle of a residential area. Those people are there for a good time for the weekend. It's, there's all kinds of problems can develop when you don't even, I haven't heard of any, but I'm not saying there couldn't be. And so I think when we look at should we or shouldn't we have some kind of say in this, it might be one of those ones similar to something else we were talking about here tonight, just do the bare minimum so we know who's in the business.
Mary?
When you read the statement on the screen and it says roofed accommodations, so does that mean if you're someone who rents a house out, or what is it, continuing accommodations, meaning it's always changing of who's staying in there? Does that include someone who's renting a house?
For short-term purposes, yes, but not for typical rentals, not like apartment rentals.
So if someone had a house and they rented it 2 months and someone else, they moved out, they had to go wherever, that doesn't count?
No, it's the 28 days is the, if it's more than 28 days, you're a long-term tenant. If it's less than 28 days, then you're falling in this category.
Say that again, I'm confused. Is it,
So if you are, 28 days is the threshold. So if you're over 28 days, it's a long-term rental, it's a apartment or whatever you want to call it.
so then it's not included in this?
It's not included in that. If it's shorter than 28 days, you're running it as accommodations.
So my only
Sure.
other question is, who's policing this to make sure that all these people actually report that? How is that going to work?
So, yeah, well, so right now the province is requiring you to register, so if they now have an agreement with Airbnb that you have to have your registration number on your listing in Airbnb. There's probably ones that aren't registering, and if their neighbors complain and they inspect, they could get a fine. Some of it will probably go under the radar, realistically, but you, in doing so, are running the risk of getting caught and being enforced on.
So does it come down to reported income or housing, or what? I don't get that.
Yeah, I think it's all those things. A lot of municipalities have been asking. Airbnb has really shook people up in the sense that it's changed the model. It used to be accommodations were hotels. They were maybe traditional bed and breakfasts where you lived there and you rented out rooms. Airbnb or VRBO or all those short-term rentals, they changed the game in the sense that people were renting out their houses or houses that they bought or built specifically for that purpose, and it was starting to have impacts in terms of housing loss and Robert's wild parties.
Sawmill parties.
Yeah, sawmill parties. So municipalities, were kind of asking we need the data to know, we don't even know where these things are. So the province is now requiring people to register. And then municipalities can do what they will with that data.
Okay.
You're using it to put a levy is one of those tools. One of the outcomes.
Darla?
Thank you, Deputy Warden Murray. I don't think this is a huge issue here.
Yeah, and that was my question, I think.
I don't think it is. I think I don't even know one Airbnb around me. I couldn't name it. I think, again, it's one of those issues where it's a one-off and you have to deal with it. I don't think we need to over-regulate everything and over-regulate people in their own homes. Times are tough. Somebody wants to run out a room. Who are we to say, did you pay $50? And did you register? And did you, are we going to need to fire inspect that room? And we need to do all these certain things. I don't know. I think it's a bit overreach myself, but maybe I'm out of touch.
Any further comments?
All right.
Get enough on that, or?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. And that wraps it up?
That's what I had. So, that's obviously not exhaustive of every topic that's going to be in these documents, but those are kind of ones that I had questions about or have big potential impact, like the agriculture issue. So, where we're going to go from here is we've already started drafting on topics that weren't affected by these questions.
Maybe just before we get into that,
Yeah.
Randy has something that he wants to say.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Warden. This is something that is, I was wondering that if we deal with it here or we'll deal with it at the Plan Advisory Committee. So I'll ask Ian if we can incorporate it in this, then I'll ask council whether we want to deal with this with this process or we deal with it separately. So, excuse me. I've been dealing with a gentleman down Little Harbor who has two great big lots, okay? And they're
Two what lots, sorry?
two big lots.
Two big lots.
Okay? And it's accessed from a private road. Beyond the private road is a bunch of other homes that are in there. And our current bylaw says that you only can have 8 homes that come off a private road before you can subdivide, right?
Yeah.
So in beyond there, there's like 18 homes, 19 homes. So the private little road comes through his father's property. It was their grand access, and it is paved road. As you get in there, there's supposed to be a cul-de-sac there for turning and things like that. Somebody has built in on that, so that took that away. So there's no, now you get driveways going in and off there and everything like that. So this gentleman wants to subdivide. He wants to give one lot to one sister, one lot to another sister off this private road, which is at pretty close to a public road, right? So we cannot give him access off of that because it's beyond the amount of lots that are allowed off a private road, okay?
Okay, gotcha.
So, is that something that we can, because this is not the only situation that's going to happen here. Right beside it, there's called the Old Pond Road. It goes in, winds in around on the other side of it. And right now, there's probably, well, 12 or 14 homes in there. But there's also a 17-acre lot that somebody bought. So somebody's going to look at probably subdividing that and developing that. So we got to look at either changing up in the amount of homes that come off a subdivision road, or we got to look at giving the authorization or power to our Director of Public Works to say, in every situation's different, that, you know, that's not going to impact anything that's happening there now, therefore you can put a driveway off that. You know, there's got to be something done here, because this guy's been we've been talking about this for probably 5-6 months now, and his father, who owns the land, is 93 years old, and he wants to see something happening before something happens with his father. So,
Gotcha.
is that something we can incorporate in this process, or?
Oh, yeah, I think this is one where I'll have to talk to Logan some more and get a better sense of the context, and yeah. Yeah, so yeah, this would be primarily in the subdivision bylaw, and it might be something this process speaks to. I couldn't say for sure right now, but it's something. Oh yeah, perfect. I'll take that. I'll talk to Logan on that one.
Yeah.
And
After the meeting, I'll just come over and I'll
Yeah.
explain a little bit more to you.
yeah. Okay.
But Logan, is this something, you know, we should be looking at here, or should the plan advisory be looking at it and then coming back to council to make any amendments?
One piece of this project was upon its completion upon the completion of the draft documents and things like that, looked like at how to coordinate with our other pre-existing bylaws and recommend changes to those as well. So, I mean, we have a subdivision bylaw to handle subdivision, but we could easily recommend changes. There probably are a lot of situations to recommend, like things like parkland dedication. If anything there were going to happen, that would probably have to find its way to subdivision bylaw as well, because then you say however many lots you're gonna have this. So it probably finds its way in either somehow into the land use bylaw itself, or as like a meshing of the intentions with our pre-existing bylaws and whatever amendments we look at making with those. But I think that was part of the intention of this process too, was to make recommendations for changes to other bylaws too.
Yeah. In order to do that, would be a separate process if we did.
You have to amend our bylaw through the
Yeah,
standard.
which is in
readings.
more public hearings and,
Yeah.
like, you would have to go out to the public and,
Your subdivision bylaw, you basically have to treat as almost like an MPS, right? You do public consultation, then hearing, and adoption, so it's a process. It's not, we agree to this change and we're done, right? There is a legislative process.
Unless they repeal the subdivision bylaw and include it in the land use bylaw, is that?
Well, no, you wouldn't want to do that, no.
You'd always want the separate bylaw.
Yeah, you
You
want
may
the-
have some policy statements in your MPS that would flow through to.
Yeah, so either way, at the end of the day, whether you started it now with PAC separately or whether it was a recommendation that came out of our process, for the recommendations that we're making for other bylaws, you would then be separately amending that subdivision bylaw to make any change, whatever it is.
okay.
Like, one of the, I think, things that when we did the initial research around it was really how other municipalities deal with it, and a lot of them are dealing with it on the basis that, well, a lot of municipalities are now saying they're not taking over any road, so every road that is created shall be private, and there'll be no onus on the municipality. Isn't a bad thing.
No, I agree.
Type thing. You eliminate a lot of liabilities, but also it's variation on number of lots, like some are 6 lots or fewer, but a lot of them are basically saying that if you want to subdivide, you have to build your road to a minimum standard. It doesn't matter if you have 1 lot on it or you have 20 lots on it. You have to build it to a certain minimum standard. Right? Which we don't have.
Yeah,
today.
or it's the first 6, it's very often the first 6 is no standards, and then if you want to go above 6, then you're upgrading to something.
And a lot of these existing ones, there's no way of doing that. You could never provide a 66-foot right-of-way in these areas, in a lot of.
Discretion's kind of that you're talking about, we were able to have some discretion for approvals.
Yeah. We have, we adopted the policy a few years ago where we'll take over private roads if people cost share or whatever. There's over 400 of those roads that actually have a 66-foot right-of-way that could qualify.
Yeah.
When the province was looking to download roads to us, we said it would bankrupt us. We actually have a policy in place, except council has the right to say, no, we're not going to do it, that could do the exact same thing.
We'll make
Okay, Darla has a question first there, David.
I'll be really quick. I just have a comment. I think we need to review this policy. This 8 lots on a road never made sense to me because it doesn't matter how big, I don't know. I just think it needs to be looked at and addressed because it's not a one-size-fits-all, and it seems like like I said earlier with property, there's no 2 things that are the same. Even if they look the same, they're not. So I think we should maybe get some recommendation from our Public Works Department and really look at our land use that we have in place with this subdivision bylaw and also our roads bylaw. I think they need to be both brought up to reflect this and reflect where we're at now, and that, I think we went through that exercise this spring or this fall, about, the province possibly downloading roads on us, and, maybe it's time that we do take a harder stance and not do any roads. I don't know, but I think we need to look at it, and I think we need to bring it up to snuff so that we're not only in line with this land use that we're doing now, but to make sure that there's some more protection there for the municipality and more leeway for our residents to do what they need to do. Thank you.
Debbie?
one of the concerns Mr. Johnson had was not knowing this Lighthouse Road, it's a private road, but who owns it, who's responsible for it? Is there any way we can find that information out? Because his father actually had a gate where the highway ended. Like, he's 92 years old. So that was always, and he's got the land on both sides, so it's a good possibility that might have been his land. And it wouldn't even surprise us if his father put the road through. But trying to find out who's responsible for that road, I know Eric Barker did pave it. He tried to get the municipality one time to cost share with him, but he did it himself in the end. He did get the road paved, the Lighthouse Road paved. So it is a good road, especially where he's looking at putting that culvert to put a driveway in for the cottage.
Whoever the original subdivider was is probably the road owner.
I don't know if they'll ever know that, like, because it's been
Right, because there is an instrument of subdivision there, because I did go back to see if it was grandfathered, because if it's prior to 87, as long as the road existed, you can, basically the rules don't apply, but it was 99, I think was what I found.
Plan was 96, but.
96,
but
yeah.
registered in 99.
Registered in 99, yeah.
I'll give Eric a call too, though, just to see, he might know.
But that road did have to come out of that parcel of land because it's right through the
Yeah,
middle.
it's right through the middle,
So,
yeah.
And the land that was beyond that wasn't owned by his father, so somebody else owned that, and they had to have access to that. So there must be something way back in the deeds giving access to.
Right, where those
properties.
other homes are built at the far end.
Yeah, so.
They're not actually part of this subdivision, they're probably part of another subdivision that's using a private road on another subdivision.
And this is why municipalities put private road regs in place, because they get messy.
Go ahead, Logan.
2 points related, both with regards to Debbie's and with regards to Darla's as well. The first sort of preface is that the intention of putting some limit on the number of properties serviced off of a private road, or like we have where, you know, after a certain number of lots, you have to construct up to a certain standard. A large part of it comes down to safety considerations. We want to be able to make sure that we have reasonable access for emergency services if and when there's ever an emergency. We don't want to have 100 lots landlocked into a parcel with the 500-meter long glorified driveway servicing them. And we have lots of areas like that, not to that maybe extent, but so I think a lot of it, and it works in some other municipalities, comes down to the responsibility that you put on the road owners. Set it in place. Some municipalities have a requirement that when you set a private road in place, you have to have it set apart as a PID, you have to have rights in place or requirements in place for a road association to be set up that essentially, like, it's like collecting a tax, right? They're collecting their own money and then putting it towards road maintenance and stuff like that. But the municipality's hands off at that point, and at the point of subdivision, we just make sure that that road association exists and there's language to it that is in line with their standards, and then we don't monitor it, they monitor it, but there are legal requirements then that outline those responsibilities. So somebody's responsible for it, and same thing as in Fiona, when all the trees were all over the place and people were cutting their ways out and nobody knew who to call, the road association could be responsible for that, let's say, in part as well. So safety and responsibility are items that we can, again, not land use bylaw, but in like a subdivision bylaw, that kind of thing. Yeah. But divest the municipality of all responsibility involved too.
Yeah, go ahead.
How do you find out, how would I go back and try to find out who owns that road? Like,
We can find out in certain instances. Roads that have specifically set aside PIDs are easy because such and such an owner is labeled as the only owner there. It gets more complicated if you get into easement agreements. That's why there's there's an argument to be made that every private road should be on a separate PID, and that's what some municipalities require. It's my personal, professional preference, as opposed to setting them on easements. We allow them to be on either on easements or on separate PIDs. So easements are trickier because then you say, you know, you might say that Andy has a right over my property to access it, but is it my responsibility to clear my portion of our private road? Or is it his responsibility so that he can access his property? Those are harder to find out, and I think it's easier to set it forth early in the subdivision stage to put those responsibilities on whoever's going to be doing it.
Yeah.
But you can check that,
I can check some things through our property online. And
okay. Because he
through
thought
historical
it was
subdivision.
PID'd. That's,
Pardon me?
he thought it was PID'd.
There is a PID on the portion that Randy mentioned that has the cul-de-sac on it, but somebody's built on top of it
Yeah.
for some reason. So
There's no PID number on the road, though.
not on
Lighthouse Road.
on the Lighthouse
No.
Road, and there was a disagreement with the Provincial Department of Public Works as to whether or not they owned it. I think that's been settled.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they definitely said
They don't own
it.
it. They haven't said they don't own it.
No, they did say
They
they
did
don't
say they
own
don't
They
own
only
it.
own,
Yeah.
they're about 20 meters away from where it shows Levi White Road going down there.
Yeah,
That's-
they cut off
that's
where
where
it
it's
divides
listed.
between Lighthouse and
Yeah.
Levi White. So, yeah, this one's different, a bit of a mess for a couple of reasons. You could argue that you have two private roads coming off of a single Y, that kind of thing too.
In the subdivision,
Yeah.
just on Debbie's point, in the subdivision I lived on, I had the residents come to me and they wanted the municipality to take it over. Make a long story short, the majority voted against it. But somebody in the meantime bought the top lot, and that row was PID to that lot above. So one of the ones came to me, well, they're responsible for that road, they're gonna have to maintain it. No, they're not. They're giving you access to that road. That's all you have is access. It's up to you guys to come up to an agreement for grading it and for snow removal and things like that. But as far as that person have to look after that road, there's no legal right. They're giving you access to your property. So, anyway, it's,
Well, and I think that's where Logan's point about having road associations comes in, is that it provides certainty to everyone, that someone owns it and someone's responsible for it. Yeah. Roads, fun times.
Yeah, Darla has a
I'm just gonna make a quick comment. I think we need to look at our road policy. I think road associations are a wonderful idea, but when they're not, and not everybody gets along. So I think we have to look at our road policy, and I think this is just kind of proving it. It's bringing it to light. So I don't know if I need a motion. Can I make a motion here? No. I think that we need to, or not make a motion, or just, I think we need to look at this, and I think we need to seriously look at it and look at our subdivision and also our roads, private roads, and I think it should be sooner than later. I think it should be in hand with this, so it's all done at one time.
Yeah.
Everyone agree to that? Yeah. Okay, we'll see that it gets on the agenda. Okay.
I just don't want us to go through the process and then we have our land use planning done, but we still don't have the subdivision done. We gotta make sure the subdivision's done sooner than later. That's my big thing. So,
Okay, so that's it, Ian?
That's it for me. So we'll be continuing drafting. We'll get to a first draft that includes what we've talked about tonight, as well as all the other suite of things that go in a planning document. We'll circulate that first internally to staff, from their perspective, to get their eyes and flag any issues that will be hard to administer or anything like that. We'll clean it up, and then we'll bring that document back to you for, to go through the high points so that you can speak on it intelligently in your communities, and so you know what's going on, and you can make any final course corrections there to the draft that we'll take out to the public and get their feedback and see where things go.
Okay. Warden has one final comment there.
I just want to make sure, and I've said this before many times, that it comes back to us before it goes public.
Yes, absolutely.
That's very important.
Yeah, I guess when it comes back to you, it will be technically public on your agenda. I don't know how that works, but yeah, that you would,
We'd give
that
it
you're going to have a
heads up.
comment on it before the public has comment on it, for sure. Yeah.
Otherwise, it's dangerous to us as counselors.
Yes,
Okay,
absolutely.
thank you, and meeting's adjourned.